Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice afternoon break. So again, we'll go to about 5:30, have a little bit of time before dinner if you want to just do a short walk or whatever you want to do, and then 7 o'clock tonight. Let's go ahead and refresh our motivation for being here. We don't need to do a formal meditation, but just take a minute or two to focus the mind, calm the mind a bit. Take a few deep breaths if you want. This is kind of nice sometimes just to really breathe in deeply. And when you do that, kind of feel every cell in your body expanding in a sense with the inhalation. And then when you exhale, just kind of let go of any tension, anything that is an obstacle for you at this moment, an obstacle to being fully present in here. And just feel that all exit from you as you exhale. Just do a few deep breaths that way. And just recall this motivation that we've been working with. As we work with these 8 pillars, we certainly can increase our own joy, our own inner well-being. And we want to think about doing this for others. So as I mentioned earlier, we can see them as just like me. Everyone is just like me, simply wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. No difference between myself and others. So just as I want this deeper well-being for myself, I also want it for all beings. So I'm here with that dual purpose to work on myself, increase my own positive qualities and understanding, so I then can be of benefit to others and help them to attain those as well. When you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. Okay, so we were in the part of acceptance, looking at acceptance of suffering in particular, kind of working with that concept, which again is very much a part of Buddhist practice. As I mentioned, mind training, there's teachings that I've alluded to a few times that were in the slides. Mind training or lojong, one of the main practices within that is what we call transforming problems or difficulty or suffering into happiness. It sounds kind of obscure from just that language, but the idea is that we take what is going on with us that seems negative and try to see how we can work with it actually to make it into something very positive. It's kind of a alchemical sort of way of working with things, or even maybe a homeopathic kind of thing. I don't know. We take something that is of the essence of being kind of challenging and difficult, and we transmute it, make it into something really wonderful. So this is a very powerful practice. Again, we're not going to go into all the details of it. That's a whole teaching in and of itself, and there are many texts that support the training and working with problems in this way. But nonetheless, I think you can get a little taste of it on the things that we are going to be pursuing in terms of this topic. So let me pull up the Book of Joy on my Kindle as well so that that's there. And then let's go into the slides. So let's see. After acceptance, and we'll see if there are any questions, anything that came up during the break or in the discussion. Um, so let's see, where is slideshow? Current slide, okay. So many of the causes of suffering come from our reacting to the people, places, things, and circumstances in our lives. rather than accepting them. We have a lot of resistance to difficulties when those come into our lives. When we react, we stay locked in judgment and criticism, anxiety and despair, even denial and addiction. It is impossible to experience joy when we are stuck in this way. If that is our reaction, when things come into our lives, that we then have that resistance, that kind of an inability to accept that that is happening to us and to work with it. Well, that's going to, again, only create less opportunity for joy to arise in the heart. It sounds strange for joy to arise when we are dealing with accepting suffering, but there's a sort of peace that comes. Once more, we're not talking about the joy that's this sort of elation and what have you. It's a deep sense of contentment within ourselves. Remember that shining contentment that we looked at last night in these descriptions of the different facets of joy. This inner well-being that is really rooted deeply in our minds based on our practice rather than something that is dependent upon things outside of ourselves. So acceptance is the sword that cuts through all of this resistance, allowing us to relax, to see clearly, and to respond appropriately. It's kind of interesting. He chose these two words, Douglas Abrams, in his thing. The previous one was where we say react, and then we had respond. I just want to talk about these because I use these. I don't think it's technically like when you go to the dictionary, you're not going to necessarily see these words defined quite precisely in that way. But the word react is kind of interesting. React. We keep reacting in the same way, doing it again and again and again. So if we kind of have that idea that do I really want to continue to keep doing the same thing over and over again? What's that phrase? Doing that and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. It's like, well, good luck. If we keep doing reacting in the same way to each time that suffering comes into our life, that we then get angry, upset, we start blaming people, we get judgmental, all of that can be, is it still on or did it get, oh, it just got, oh, okay. Oh, okay. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I was still on. Um, so reacting is not the way we want to be. Responding, I like respond because it comes from the same word as responsible, responsibility. Well, that's taking responsibility for how we are going to actually work with a situation. As I mentioned in Buddhist terms, the situations that we have that we call suffering, that we call problems, give them that label, problems, difficulties, are creations of our own karma. They're not something that is coming out of the blue that we never ordered. There's a wonderful book title by Ajahn Brahm called "Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung?" Like, you know, it's like we can say that, like, who ordered this truckload of dung? Why is this on my doorstep? But we ordered it. Guess what? You put in the order maybe a few lifetimes ago, and now it's shown up. So what do we do? How do we respond creatively to that truckload of dung? How do we actually work with it, taking responsibility for it? I just want to point that out because, we're dealing with this idea of acceptance, but acceptance has and that flavor of changing what we are doing instead of reacting with that continual habitual way of just stepping in it again and again and again. We're going to respond. We're going to actually think about how can I take responsibility for this? How can I say, okay, this is partly my own creation. Now, when we do have just the Buddhist view too, just to clarify, when you do have people that are doing things to you that are harmful to you, we're not letting them off the hook in a sense. We're going to look at this in regard to forgiveness, even that's coming up as the first pillar of the heart. But the idea is that we take responsibility for kind of that joint thing that's going on. The person is harming us, but why are they harming us? Because we must have done something to them in the past that has now ripened into this, kind of creation of this particular instant in time. So it's never something we're like complete victims of, innocent victims standing on the roadside and suddenly something happens to us. We created it and it's now coming home to roost in a sense. I find it interesting, the Western ways of approaching karma. Um, I heard this phrase, it's being thrown around sometimes that karma's got your address, so some people say, like, don't worry, karma's got their address. I mean, it's a really strange way of working with karma. Karma does follow you around, though. I mean, it does have your address in a sense, but it's not don't make it into something that's a personification or whatever. It's just the energy we've created that catches up with us based on just different causes and conditions that come into play. So, when karma comes home and it says, okay, now it's ripened for us. Well, that's a really wonderful opportunity to say, okay, how did I create that? How can I take responsibility for that and say, I'm going to do something different this time? Why? Because I don't want to experience that again. I mean, who wants to experience suffering? That once more is kind of a starting point for seeing all beings as the same as us and for recognizing our own desire that is driving the whole show to be happy, to avoid suffering. Nothing wrong with that. As I mentioned the other night when I did the talk on fear, the Buddha never said, this is your problem. You want happiness and you don't want suffering. The Buddha said how you're going about achieving those things is a problem. But your fundamental desire to be happy and avoid suffering, not a problem. So if you don't want to suffer, if you don't want to have these things that are coming into your life that you call problems, difficulty, whatever, then you have to learn how you created them and undo that in a sense by not doing the same thing again and again and learning how to respond more effectively to them. And of course, there are many tools that are used within mind training, Lojong, to work with that idea, taking it all the way to the point of really how do we use what we're experiencing as a tool to connect with the suffering of others. That's one of the other pillars of the heart that we're going to talk about, compassion. So this is the idea behind this. Can we respond more effectively rather than reacting, re-reacting? Okay. So I'm quoting once more Viktor Frankl, another quote from, I believe this is also from Man's Search for Meaning. When a man finds, that's why I'll use person. Again, he uses man to refer to human beings, but when a person finds that it is their destiny to suffer, they will have to accept their suffering as their task. They will have to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, they are unique and alone in the universe. No one can relieve them of their suffering or suffer in their place. Their unique opportunity lies in the way in which they bear their burden. Now, when we say no one is, that we're unique in the particular suffering that we're experiencing in that moment, not unique in that we're suffering, because that's that first truth that the Buddha taught, right? We're all in the same boat. We're all dealing with conditioned existence and all the craziness of it and things happening due to our karma, our delusions. But how we choose to bear our burden is entirely in our court. Again, we saw a quote very similar to this, but the idea here is particularly looking at the point of this is our suffering, and this is something that we. And he was Jewish, he wasn't Buddhist, so he didn't have the view of karma. But the idea is that this is our challenge. This is what we are facing. And it's up to us to decide how we are going to bear that burden. So we have some choices. There's another book I found by this psychologist, Steve Taylor. I think he's kind of a little bit of a pop psychologist guy, Out of the Darkness from Turmoil to Transformation. He says, I like this quote, there will always be some degree of suffering in our lives. And when it comes, we should try not to see it in wholly negative terms. We should always be aware that buried inside it, there is an opportunity for growth and transformation. Now, once more, I emphasized this previously. This is not the sort of advice that when somebody comes to you and they're in tears and everything's going wrong, and you say, you need to look for that wonderful opportunity that's buried deep inside your pain. Maybe if you're really close to them and they know that you're going to be that type of person and they are looking for that, that might be appropriate, but it's not usually not. I mean, what we need to do generally is just be with someone, listen to someone, hear their pain, validate their pain. And then maybe we have an opening sometime later to help them to transform that and look at it differently. But for ourselves, this is really the ideal way to approach our problems, our difficulties. Say, what's the jewel inside there? How can I find something in there that will actually benefit me? And of course, by way of that, benefit others. Because I will grow. I will change my mind. I will become a better person. I will be able to, be of greater benefit in the short term and the long term to others through that. So that's the idea behind it is we should be looking at these things that are, we call suffering. Again, he's using a more conventional way that we talk about suffering. What I mentioned earlier about dukkha includes even, again, our pleasant experiences because they have an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Even when we're having our humor and laughter and joy in our lives through that type of thing, looking at comics or whatever the case might be, there's always still not a final satisfaction there. It's just a temporary relief. And we need to find something that's more lasting. But here, when we look at suffering and the way we're looking at suffering in this particular section of the book, we're really talking about what we call pain, what we call anguish, the things that we identify very easily as suffering in our world. Those are really rich opportunities for us to work with because that's where the suffering of ourselves as well as the suffering of others becomes more noticeable, right? We respond more out of seeing that grosser form of suffering. Sometimes we don't even respond as well to mental suffering, certainly. We were talking a little bit last night after class about mental health in this country and the fact that there's a lot that's going on under the surface that people aren't aware of and that people aren't addressing, even, taking responsibility themselves. But when suffering does come into our lives or we see it in others, it is an opportunity for us. Just again, depends upon our perspective, how we look at it. Let's talk a little bit. Again, I could have spent more time certainly on that whole concept of looking at suffering and how to embrace it in the sense of accepting that this is once more something that we all are going to have to deal with. It's just like we said, nobody gets out of here alive. Nobody also gets out of here without some measure of suffering. We talk about this, grosser way that beings suffer. On the role of Buddhist practice and acceptance, much of traditional Buddhist practice is directed toward the ability to see life accurately beyond all expectations, projections, and distortions that we typically bring to it. Meditative practice allows us to quiet the distracting thoughts and feelings so that we can perceive reality and respond to it more skillfully. Again, Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on meditative or contemplative practice. Many traditions have ways of approaching this, and certainly even in Buddhism, the Buddha learned meditative techniques from the Vedic traditions that were there in India at the time when he was, as Prince Siddhartha, going through his training to eventually find the truths that he found. So there's nothing kind of miraculous about Buddhist meditation. It's just pointing out that in Buddhism, meditation is the main tool that we use to be able to work with our minds, to tame what is counterproductive in our minds and to advance those things that are more positive, that help us to develop deeper understanding and awareness, and all these other qualities that come along, compassion, loving kindness, and so on. The ability to be present in each moment is nothing more and nothing less than the ability to accept the vulnerability, discomfort, and anxiety of everyday life. It is kind of interesting to say that, at some level, our meditation practice and being present in every moment is a practice of acceptance, practice of being with whatever it is that is going on. And many of you have a meditation practice. You know that some days you sit down to do your meditation and you have to just accept that the mind is going like you know, a yo-yo or something all over the place. And then other times when our minds are completely dull and foggy and we just have to accept that and maybe work with it as best as we can. It's just, this is the place of acceptance and the place of opening to what is going on in our lives. And to see that this is, I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh who used to use this phrase, present moment, wonderful moment, that there is something rich in every moment. We're going to see that even coming up in gratitude, also one of those four pillars of the heart. But this is part of our practice as Buddhists, and again, anyone who's in a contemplative tradition, is to be able to look at staying present in the mind, staying open and aware to what is going on, accepting our vulnerability, anxiety, accepting that some days our minds are going to be completely agitated, some days our minds are going to be very peaceful. And to develop that deeper understanding of reality, as His Holiness says, with that, you can go beyond appearances and relate to the world in a much more appropriate, effective, and realistic manner. And he says he often gives the example of how we should relate to our neighbors. If you're going to live with folks that are right next door to you or in the same immediate neighborhood to you, you treat them really well, right? You kind of understand that it's an interdependent situation again, and that for you to be negligent of that would simply have, kind of bad ramifications. So again, we just try to and relate to everything quite effectively, relate to that interdependence, relate to the realities that we deal with every day of our lives. Yeah. So again, just putting this in here because I did spend a fair amount of time talking about it. And he says we come back then to the beginning of our discussion and Shanti questions, right? He said, why be disgruntled about something if you can change it? And why be disgruntled about it if you can't change it? Neither one of them makes any sense. So the kind of acceptance that the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop were advocating is not passive. It is powerful. I think that's the one thing to emphasize too, is that we're not talking about, once more, even like we did with humility, you don't become a doormat. You don't just say, oh, I accept that everything's fine going on and whatever it is, and I just don't do anything about it. Accepting is always, again, the first step to changing things. That was pointed out earlier by the Archbishop, right, when he was dealing with um, apartheid in South Africa. You have to acknowledge that this is a problem and this is what's going on and these are the causes of it and everything. And then you can start putting into place the things that will actually affect some change. But if you don't accept it, nothing else happens. But it's very active, it's not passive at all. It does not deny the importance of taking life seriously and working hard to change what needs changing, to redeem what needs redemption. You must not hate those who do harmful things, the Dalai Lama has explained. The compassionate thing is to do what you can to stop them, for they are harming themselves as well as those who suffer from their actions. So I want to take it off screen for a moment because I do think that this is something that merits a little more talk. When we see others who are engaged in wrongdoing, again, wrongdoing gets to be subjective in some ways, but there still is an objective truth out there to what is wrong and what is right. Buddhism is based on the concept of ahimsa. Ahimsa, this Sanskrit word, means non-harmfulness. And it's usually equated to compassion. But I like that kind of negation thing, not harming through our actions. Of course, not harming ourselves, certainly, through what we do, but also not harming other beings. And that's sort of the bottom line. Again, I'm not denying other traditions have a form of that, maybe not extended to the degree that Buddhism does, because Buddhism includes all our wonderful animal creatures that inhabit this planet with us. And so my experience with Catholicism was that, yeah, animals are fine, but animals don't have souls. Animals don't have this and that. So it was kind of putting down any sort of, yeah, looking at them through the lens of them needing protection and what have you in the same way that humans do. Yes, it's important that we don't hurt human beings, but it's also important that we don't hurt other life in this world. So ahimsa is a guiding principle. And when we see beings who are harming other beings, and it's not our job to go there and just put them in their place and do whatever we can to do that, but we should have at least compassion for them because we see that what they are doing is so misguided, that it is not something that's going to lead to good results. Of course, in Buddhism, that's because of karma. When you engage in actions that are harmful to others, you are invariably creating the karma for yourself to be harmed. It's a concept that we're going to see surfacing again in terms of compassion. He throws in a little bit about compassion here right now, because I think once more, it's about how we don't just simply accept that there is harm going on in our world, but we have compassion for the harm givers and do what we can to help them to stop doing what they're doing. Again, I don't want to make it seem like we have complete permission to do whatever we want to stop those who are harming, because if we harm them in the process of keeping them from harming others, it's not really ideal, right? Then we're going against the whole principle. Buddhism, this concept of ahimsa, was also the grounding for Gandhi's campaign in India for liberation from the British government. It was a campaign of nonviolence, a campaign of saying, I am not going to engage in any of the means that the other party is using that are trying to keep me in place and do what I want or what they want me to do. I'm going to do it peacefully without any conflict. It's hard to live our lives this way. But we should be looking ideally when we do see things in our world that need to be changed, that need to be addressed. What's the peaceful solution? How do we approach it from that vantage point? Having ahimsa be our guide, non-harmfulness be our guide. We are trying to diminish harm in the world. So we don't just accept that there is harm going on and just put our hands up. We were talking over lunch about gun violence in this country. And there we are getting to a place of complacency with it, which is, brought up by Unju. It's very easy to kind of go, okay, well, we just have to accept that this is part of our world now. That gun violence is going to go on in schools and movie theaters and, amusement parks and wherever. Well, I don't think that's the right response. We need to do what we can to remove that violence, to help beings who are prone to doing that violence to get what they need so that they don't fall to that type of behavior, right? So these are complex things. We can't solve these problems in the course of just an afternoon in October at Land of Medicine Buddha, but we can at least have the awareness that these call for compassionate responses, not just mere acceptance like, okay, as we saw earlier, acceptance is not just some kind of resignation to saying, okay, that's part of our world. We have to become an agent of change in our world in a non-violent way. I don't know if there's anything more I need to say on that. Does anyone want to share anything on that? It's kind of a big one because again, I don't think Buddhism is calling for us to simply let people do whatever they want to do. And when we see people, especially people of power in our world, doing things that are really horrible, horrific, well, then we need to speak up at least, at least sign your petitions or do whatever you need to do, get out in the streets and protest, do something to show that this is not okay. Again, within nonviolent means. Okay. No comments. Let's go on then. Oh, yes, please, Mary. It'd be great. Not quite. We're going to do a little bit more, but that's okay. Yeah, please.
I was wondering if you could help me understand the difference between acceptance versus repression.
Repression.
Like
Mm,
instead of accepting something about myself, I'm just going to repress it
yeah.
and not
Yeah.
think about it.
Um, I mean, again, the term repression, I guess, is used more in Western psychology and things. And, and Buddhism isn't so keen on repression, obviously. We don't want to really repress things. We sort of want to bring them to the surface and make sure that we do something that is constructive, that disallows those things from arising. Um, the whole logic, I looked at this a little bit last night, and I'll go into it again, perhaps, a bit. But in Buddhism, we sort of begin to recognize and accept, okay, here's hatred coming up in my mind towards a political candidate or towards people who support the political candidate or whatever it is that is going on. I have this hatred that I can kind of accept and say, okay, this is a part of me. This is a part of me that is not so well trained, that is following that habitual pattern of reacting to what I see as offensive, as what I see as something that I don't like going on. So what we can do once more is we can replace that rather than repressing it, rather than saying, okay, I'm just going to stuff it down inside me and not let it come to the surface, but not do anything to address it. What we're going to do instead is we're going to take that same person or persons and we're going to see if we can change our thinking about them, our attitude about them. Of course, the attitudes that we want to generate that are the ideal antidote to hatred are love, compassion, caring about that other person or those people deeply. That's why I don't think we're ever going to make progress in this country at healing divides, such as what I'm kind of alluding to by what I'm talking about, until we can look at the other person through those eyes of compassion and love and really see that they're suffering too. Then what happens is when you begin to generate loving kindness and compassion towards those beings, hatred has no place to arise. You've kind of taken the ground out from underneath it. It has no grounding anymore because you are not choosing to look at those beings through the lens of hatred. You are not seeing what is negative about them, focusing on that, making that the whole picture of who they are, and despising them, wanting them off the planet, vote them off the island. You're not taking that approach. You're taking an approach of, yes, this person is doing things, saying things that are hateful, hurtful, but I'm going to choose to see them through the lens of loving kindness. I'm going to actually not repress my hatred. I'm going to replace my hatred with a much more constructive mental state. I mean, I was working with one student, and the student was essentially telling me, what they were picking up on in terms of how I was working with them was that I was telling them just to not have these thoughts. And I've never said that. If I ever say that to anybody, any of you, please tell me that I'm totally screwed up. Because Buddhism is not about telling people don't think that way. Don't have that hatred. Buddhism is about acknowledging, accepting that we do have those states of mind and we want to replace them with something else. Right? It's like, okay, I'm going to not have hatred towards that being. I want to generate loving kindness towards them. And it's a much more, what's interesting is this, His Holiness goes into this frequently. He says, why this is so powerful is because this is true over here. When we look at others through the lens of loving kindness and compassion, then we are seeing them accurately. They are beings that simply want to be happy and don't want to suffer. And that's what we're wishing for. We want them to be happy. We want them to not suffer. That's what loving kindness and compassion are. There's no fault there, right? Because we're looking at them as suffering sentient beings, beings who are bereft of happiness, and we're simply wishing them to have that. There's no distortion. Whereas that mind of hatred that is looking at them through that lens, as I was just saying, it paints the whole picture of them being a horrible, awful person, makes them into, the enemy. We create the enemy in our own minds. The enemy is not something out there. It's how we choose to look at that person. We paint them entirely as horrible, awful, doing all these horrible things. And as I pointed out, I think this was in my talk on fear the other night, think about the time when you've been a real a-hole to somebody. We've all done it at one time or another where we said something or did something to somebody, and we were the kind of the bad guy. We were the person looking kind of nasty and awful to them because maybe we even did it under the influence of drinking or whatever, who knows. But we were rude, we were awful. Would you want that person to think that that is who you are? Absolutely. That you are that one person, that one moment in time when you got the red face and looked horrible and were yelling at somebody and being awful. We know we're different than that, right? We're only that one, that's one moment in time, and that is not the sum total of who we are. And most people are not the sum total of those particular moments. Some people get really good at recreating those moments and they become seen as that. But hatred is seeing them entirely painted that way, saying, okay, this is who you are. I pigeonholed you. I put you into this category of somebody who is nasty, awful, horrible, and that's how I'm going to choose to see you. And I'm going to have hatred for you. But that's not the accurate picture. It's not truth. Whereas over here, when we see beings through the lens of loving kindness and compassion, it's just acknowledging that they simply want to be happy, don't want to suffer. Yeah, they may be misguided in how they're going about achieving that, but hey, so are we often. We're often going about things in a misguided way. So we can have some space around it, some opening for us to be able to look at others differently. So, in answer to your question, yes, I mean, repression is making kind of stuffing it in, and it's only going to become a problem and sort of abscess within us. Whereas we want to take and acknowledge that this is what we are kind of habitually reacting. This is how we are normally looking at things. We're going to try to respond more effectively through loving kindness and compassion. We can say that all of these negative emotions have an opposite. For example, jealousy. If you're really jealous of people in your life, if you're finding that's what's going on for you, well, then start to rejoice. We talked about rejoicing last night, this wonderful practice of generating joy in what other people have, the good fortune that they have. Even people who have billions. I don't know who's the richest person on the planet. Is it Elon Musk, or is he the richest one now? I mean, most people, well, a lot of people, when they look at him, don't rejoice at all, right? They're like, oh, what is this guy doing with all the money he has or whatever? Buying Twitter and whatever now, what X or but we should be rejoicing. he did not create all of that karmically without having done good things. It's kind of a little bit of a riddle, perhaps, for some people, but that's the way it works. The karma of generosity is that you get resources. People who are billionaires must have been incredibly generous to get that kind of karma. Yeah. Yes, Anja.
Yeah, I feel rather unsettled with this discussion of karma
Uh-huh.
um, um, uh, on both sides. So, one is people who are suffering now.
Hmm.
And what I understood you saying a few minutes ago was that that's because of something that they did
Hmm.
previously
Hmm.
that's then coming back to repay them. But then that sounds to me like it's really blaming people who are victims.
Hmm.
Like it sounds to me then if
I
somebody
understand.
experiences something like, so say like a POC experiences discrimination, or a woman experiences assault, or a child experiences abuse, then that's saying it's because of something that
Hmm.
you did previously. And I just don't think that that's
I
true.
understand.
And then the flip side of that is what you just said about people now who have a lot of power and money, that they must have done something very good. But I also don't really believe that. I think that there's a whole lot of luck. And then there's just, um, there are some, our society is built so that some people receive more fortune than other people. They're more likely to succeed than other people.
Mhm.
And it's not because they did something so wonderful in
I
the
understand.
past.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand. But trust me, Andrew, that these questions, when I start talking about karma, invariably come up because it is a very, very different system of looking at things. One thing I want to kind of preface, I should have maybe even prefaced what I said with, is that when we talk about karma, or when I talk about karma, how I frame it is that it's an explanation, but not a justification. Explanation meaning in the same way that if we were to look at what's going on with climate change, right? And there are scientists who have explained what has happened with the environment and with the air and everything happening and the warming of the planet and the carbon dioxide and the da 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 and all these various things. It's an explanation, right? It's not getting into morals or justification or what have you and kind of saying, oh, this should be happening or shouldn't be happening. It's just an explanation. And well, yeah, but
Blame involved with that.
blame is not a word that I've used, and I don't want to even invite its use because I will never say we're going to blame somebody for what they've done. The idea, so again, if I say it's an explanation, it means it is an understanding of why things happen. It is not a justification in the sense of saying, oh, that this person should be rewarded and this person should be punished. It's simply saying an explanation of why those things happen. Now, again, going back to what you're talking about, it does invite that kind of blame or guilt or other emotions because we have a tendency of seeing it that way. But in a sense, it is acknowledging, and again, because Buddhism deals with past lifetimes and everything, you got not just this life. So even when you have a innocent child who is fresh out of the womb and is abused or something, you're not seeing the full picture because you're not seeing everything that preceded that lifetime. It's simply a mechanism by which sentient beings have experiences. It's not meant to say that they're bad people, horrible people, awful people, pointing the finger at them, blaming the victim, as you say. It's rather meant to be simply an explanation. Within that explanation, of course, is the potential for taking responsibility. If I go to some of the things that you alluded to, like it's luck or that there's other factors involved that are playing a greater role than perhaps, the actions of that person, well, then we do run into kind of a problem in that if we, again, I'm taking on the Buddhist hat here, if we are really going to follow the Buddhist path to liberation, to nirvana, to a place where we can be free of all that conditioning, because karma is the main conditioning factor that dictates what we experience, well, then it has to be pretty absolute. If karma isn't the cause of things, if you were able to remove that factor by pacifying your mind, doing all the work that Buddhism asks you to do, then what would happen is we would still experience suffering and difficulty. We would still be conditioned in some way because it's not just karma. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of the idea is that karma contains within it the teachings that explain pretty much everything. Yes, other things do play some role in terms of certain conditions happening that allow certain karmas to ripen, but nonetheless, there's some karmic conditioning even in some of that. We end up kind of being somewhat under the control of our karma. We even use that phrase. Sentient beings are under the control of their karma and delusions. So maybe we're all victims in that way, but we are the creators of that. We, through the force of our minds, can change that. I find the teachings on karma incredibly empowering. I can't remember, was it Beverly? I can't, one of you were talking last night about how when you were hearing teachings in Catholic school or Catholic, that it wasn't quite a satisfactory explanation for what's going on. I found the teachings on karma to be a satisfactory explanation. And I know that there's these emotional things that come into play that make us look at it through that lens. And it feels like we're to blame and you're blaming the victim, but it's actually quite empowering. It's actually quite, it gives us the opportunity to look at it from that perspective of I'm the creator of this. Therefore, I can uncreate it in a sense. I can do something different, respond more proactively, and create something better in the future. Whereas if all these other things are at play, luck and all these other things, even no matter what I do, I could still end up getting the, crap end of the stick. I could still end up suffering in spite of all that. If karma is the tool by which sentient beings have experiences, and it is the absolute thing that dictates that, changing that will change my experience without a doubt.
Can you be a Buddhist without believing in karma? If somebody says they're
Well,
Buddhist,
I
does that
mean,
mean
yeah,
they must believe in karma?
there are many Buddhists, I would say, yeah, not many, but certainly some Buddhists. Even Stephen Batchelor, who I mentioned earlier, he's a translator of that book by Shantideva. He's been around Tibetan Buddhism a long time and dabbled in other forms of Buddhism. And he actually wrote a book called Buddhism Without Beliefs. And he considers himself Buddhist because he feels like he's following the core teachings of the Buddha. And he doesn't really teach that much about like karma or rebirth or anything. He finds those teachings to be kind of superfluous. And he even thinks that perhaps there's a cultural element based on what was taught in India at the time when the Buddha formulated his Dharma, his teachings. So I don't want to, again, what does being Buddhist mean? Following the Buddha's teachings, the basic Buddhist teachings that, as I mentioned last night, are working with your mind. But to me, the ideas of karma and rebirth give me a structure by which I can see the progress I will make on the basis of working with my mind. If I work with my mind for the duration of this life and there is no rebirth, and that's a materialist view that is very common in our world, scientific view of like, you're here having consciousness because all of this gray matter is doing what it's doing and all the electrochemical stuff is happening. And when that all shuts down, poof, your consciousness is gone. That's one view. I don't find that very inspiring. I want to think that there's something, some product of what I'm doing that goes on, that carries on. And when I heard those teachings, of course, I was quite excited. That gave me some timeline to look at that is way beyond this life. That gives me hope for being able to develop my mind to a greater degree. But the idea of karma being the principle by which all of that happens and creating new lifetimes and creating new experiences and so on gives me the mechanism by which I can affect that change. There is a duration of mind going beyond this life, just as we say mind even goes prior to this life without any beginning, which is a mind-blowing concept. But anyway, we have this idea of karma being the means by which we can restructure our life. We can make our life into what we choose. Karma is the principle behind becoming a Buddha, essentially. So when we talk about Buddhists who don't believe in karma, I still have that question of like, well, but then even if you work on your mind in this life, what are you really doing with that? Where is that going to? You become a kinder, gentler, more compassionate person in this life. Well, that's nice, but what's the product of that? Where does it go from there? To me, the structure of karma and rebirth really gives Buddhism so much more meaning and so much more depth, because I'm then working with things over a much longer horizon. And especially when you look at, my gosh, I've talked about all the teachings and things to meditate on and everything in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. It's kind of mind blowing to think about doing that all in this life. It's huge. I mean, I've been practicing Buddhism for over 30 years, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface in many ways. And we're trying to reverse a mind that we've had since beginningless time that has been kind of screwed up and make it into something that is enlightened and perfect and wonderful. I mean, it's going to take a while. So I hear, going back to the initial question, some of your concerns, and I honor them. I think that they're a natural response that we have because of the way that we look at things in our culture. But blame shouldn't enter into it. Guilt shouldn't enter into it. We should simply acknowledge that this is the mechanism by which beings are having certain experiences. And it should break our hearts. I mean, the one thing that I think sometimes when people hear the teachings on karma too, you haven't said this, but they almost feel like we become sort of detached from the suffering of others then. We just kind of look at it as matter of fact, in the same way that we might look at cause and effect in our world around us in a very detached way. Oh, well, yeah, these things are happening and that's growing and this is going on over here, but it's all just happening independent of me in a sense. When we see the suffering that beings have to go through because they are first unaware of their karma and how that is playing a role in their experience of happiness or suffering. And secondly, that at the very deep level, they have an ignorance that's driving the whole show. This is a much deeper teaching in Buddhism. It should break our hearts. We're looking at sentient beings regardless of what's going on with them and just feel like this is horrible that sentient beings are doing this. They're creating their own suffering through their ignorance of the nature of reality as well as karma. These are the two main ignorances that we talk about in Buddhism. Having an ignorance of karma, an inability to live one's life according to that principle and be aware of it, is invariably going to cause us to suffer because we're not going to make right decisions, right choices about what we do. And having an ignorance of reality is just going to keep us spinning from life to life to life. And we're never going to be free of all of this. So it's not meant to be something to make us feel kind of impersonal towards beings who are dealing with this, or even ourselves who are dealing with it. It's meant to be very engaging, to pull us in and to say, guess what? The Buddha gave us all the information we need to work with. We need to understand that we're in the driver's seat and we can make a choice about where we want to go. I find that really liberating and empowering. And I can see the other side of it too, as I was saying. I can honor that and say yes. And it looks horrible and it feels horrible, to think that a young child, we can give a lot of innocence. We label that innocence on them, but we aren't seeing what came prior. But we can certainly see that as a young child to have to go through really deep suffering and abuse is horrible. And it's horrible that that exists in our world. And that's kind of the extent of it. We're not going to blame the child for having created that. We're going to instead look at it and understand that this is the mechanism by which those sorts of things occur. Anyway, I don't want to belabor any of this, but it's a tough one. It's a tough one that many people who come to Buddhist teaching struggle with because it is quite foreign to us and it is subject to these sorts of ways of looking at it that I understand. So,
Yeah, I guess I just don't agree with it.
okay, I
Just-
understand.
those beliefs are just not consistent with mine. A few years ago, there was a tech leader who responded to women in tech talking about how they don't get paid as much
Uh-huh.
by alluding to karma
Mm.
and telling them that they needed to wait. They didn't respond well to that for understandable reasons.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
understand.
so I just it's just not consistent with my beliefs, but much of the rest of Buddhism is.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to say what's two more quick things. And one is you said belief. And Venerable Rabina, who I mentioned before, she's a wonderful Australian nun, been around in our tradition many, many years. She says seeing it as a belief is a little distorted because she says rather the way that we should approach karma, and I'm not again, can make your own choices. That's the whole thing about Buddhism. We're all here making our own choices and, having our own perspective. But the idea is that if we see it more as a working hypothesis, because the one thing I can't do is I can't prove karma to you. I can't say, oh, you had this experience here because you did this 5 lifetimes ago, and you can see it just as clear as you can see, a marble in your hand or something. It's an obscured thing because we're talking about a sort of energy that we create that carries with us that ripens into an experience. It's pretty subtle in terms of what's happening there. So she uses this idea of using it as a working hypothesis. It's kind of like you live your life just like a scientist would investigate things on the basis of a theory, a hypothesis about why things happen, and see if it proves true. So it's not to say that, again, we're going to see immediate effects. John Lennon sang about instant karma, but Buddhism doesn't teach really instant karma. But we can see the effects on our minds and how we're living our lives when we become pretty meticulous in attending to our actions in that way, saying, I'm going to stop doing the things that harm others and that harm myself and see what happens. And you don't necessarily need the Buddha's teachings to do that. Many teachings of different traditions help us to be better people. When we act as better people, we do see that our lives get better, that the way we relate to others gets better, that we start seeing this positive effect. So that's her point of view, is just to use it as a working hypothesis. The other thing that I'm going to throw out there, and maybe I'm opening a can of worms with this, but she often gets these questions. I have actually witnessed her get these questions sometimes, the sorts of things like, okay, there was just this, incident of a young child who was killed or abused or whatever, and how is this explained according to karma and da da da. And she always says it's interesting that we always look at the negative side and need an explanation for that, but we don't need an explanation for the good side. Because we do have a default that thinks that everything is supposed to be good for us, right? That everything is supposed to come our way. That's kind of an expectation, but karma is working on both sides of the fence, folks. It's producing the good experiences that you have, it's producing the horrible experiences that you have. This is how it's all happening. But we do tend to get quite focused in when we see suffering happening that we feel it's inexplicable. I mean, there's horrible things that go on in this world. We've seen them, in this country and all over the world. And look at what's happening in Gaza, and you don't have to go very far to just kind of open up the paper, turn on the internet, whatever, and we can see that. And we can have a real feeling like this is inexplicable, that human beings do this to each other. And what happened on October 7th last year, horrible, horrible things, right? But also good things happen. And they're all products of the same principle, the law of cause and effect, how things come into play. And so we have to use the same questioning to look at the good side of it as we do at the bad side of it and say, okay, why are good things happening in the world? There's that book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? Well, you should have one. Why does anything happen to anybody? Why do good things happen to good people? But we have this tendency to think that we're all supposed to have good things happen to us. Like when you get born, that's your right. But anything that's against that is wrong. Well, let's look at that more closely. Yeah, you were going to share something maybe, Lindsay?
Well, I was just going to add that I totally relate to this struggle, and karma is such a huge topic, so I don't know if I'm qualified to add a comment, but I just thought I would try anyway. I remember, first of all, your first question of like, can I be a Buddhist but not for this? I've had many teachers say, if something isn't making sense, leave it for now. Just leave it, see what happens. And I think that might be what you were saying about working hypothesis, because the larger tradition is definitely about, really, it should prove itself to you whether the teaching is a good one or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was like in 2005, and I was in India when I saw like the young children with their eyes gouged out to beg on the street. And I'm sorry, that should have come with a trigger warning or something. And I remember that was the first time I heard somebody say, well, it's their karma. And as like an American social justice activist type, I was like, what?
What?
Like, this is insane. I was so incensed by it. And then I started also going to like Buddhist, classes and trainings and things, and it seemed like there was always this focus on sort of individual practice and like being in the cave and practicing and going on retreat. And I was like, I remember standing up in a hall in like 2007 in Georgia and saying like, this sounds like such a privileged attitude, you know, it just seems ridiculous. I just want to, you know, those kinds of thoughts. And then I guess where I sort of am with it right now, to the extent, I actually think it's karma that makes that, I don't mean this totally derisively, but that makes that tech bro say something like that. It's not necessarily that that's what explains the pay gap in Silicon Valley or something. It's what would make someone think they can even say something like that, or with slavery, or why do you have events between Hamas and the border there in Gaza and Israel, but for many generations of karma that people are born with and conditioned into. And so I think that there is sort of like a real wisdom in thinking that it's a collective karma that we share, at least for me, when I think about but moving away from blaming individuals for these horrible conditions and more about like how these conditions get passed on, and like we have institutionalized racism and so forth. And so it's insidious, and that's the karma. It's not like the individual. It's, for me, it's less about like the individual's karma. It's more like about how these things get passed on lifetime after lifetime, and we sort of inherit them. And I think when I got in touch with that, I remember a teacher years ago kind of like exploded my whole thing, because I'm a pastor's kid. I was raised Christian, and he was saying something along the lines of, it's really important that we realize we're practicing for more than this lifetime. And I had always thought, well, whether I'm Christian or Buddhist or whatever, I can't know for sure what'll happen when I die. So I should just practice the best I can, and then I won't know. But then that really stuck with me. I was like, why? Why would it be so important that I practice for more than this lifetime? And this is just probably a partial understanding or where I am with it now. But one of the things that started unfolding for me is just saying like, well, can we certainly see that the effects of this horrible tradition of slavery is still with us? Definitely. Can we see that the horrible effects of, you know, empire and colonization are still with us? Definitely. Can we see that, you know, if I kind of like go through, they're definitely still with us, and they definitely last beyond a single generation or a single lifetime. And those are just some of the ways that I've gotten, I don't know, less at such a like blaming the child or the victim, and more at like the way these types of minds operate over very long time horizons. And then it does open me up to think about what I can do in this lifetime of mine to be you know, to try to purify that or address that. I don't know if that's helpful, but
Oh, thank you, Lindsay. That was good. Appreciate that. Let me just add one little thing before we go to Carol, but um, I'm sorry, I didn't say that as well about like this idea of setting things aside. And certainly I'm not, when I was answering the question about is it possible for Buddhists to not believe in karma or to not hold that? I mean, really, as you're approaching Buddhism, there's always going to be things that we're not quite comfortable with investigating or feel like we can just take on board. And that's perfectly fine to have that mentality of like, okay, well, I'm just going to set this aside. But rather than like throwing it in the trash can, that's a much better approach of just saying, right now, I can't get my head around that, or right now, it feels problematic. And setting it aside and saying, maybe I'll investigate this after I've had more other teachings and had a better understanding of everything that's involved in Buddhism or whatever. I think that's a very healthy way to go about it. But if you do find that after investigating Buddhism for some time, that you've got everything on the shelf or most of it on the shelf and very little that you find that you're subscribing to, well, then maybe Buddhism is not what you're meant to follow. And His Holiness says that's why we have different spiritual traditions, because we're not all like cookie cutter exact replicas of each other and all looking for the same spiritual tradition. We're all looking for something that resonates with us. And I explained my own finding that the teachings on karma and rebirth were refreshing to me, were like a gift to me. Like this explains it. This gives me so much more to work with in terms of how to deal with the dilemma we're all in and to look at the ways of getting out of it. Anyway, yeah. Thank you, Lindsay and Anja.
We could use a feel good story.
Yes, Carol.
I have a daughter who works in gang prevention in the
Wonderful.
city of Stockton. She works with young adults, many of whom have never been outside the city of Stockton
Mm,
unless they were in prison.
mm,
She works with them coming out of prison and trying to come out of gangs. Well, yesterday she sent me a picture, and the picture was of about 30 young people.
mm,
And our Monterey Bay Aquarium invited these 30 young people to come and
mm.
spend the whole day. And
Wonderful.
they took them around with docents and gave them lunch, and it made such a difference.
Wonderful.
So she deals with responsibility and acceptance
Uh-huh.
and just giving them the experience of coming out of everything they lived with and they know to something new and different was just a wonderful
That's great.
experience.
That's great. And again, I think it's this concept of acceptance, and then we're going to get, yeah, soon into the pillars of the heart and the response that we have to the situation that beings are in or that we find them in. And this type of a compassionate response of saying, okay, I'm going to take people who are in that category, I'm going to give them something different and informative and an experience that helps them. I mean, that's just a beautiful thing to do. And that's again the compassionate response that we should be having. If Buddhism was just simply looking at things and, oh, this is how it is, and yeah, everyone, good luck working out your own little situation, that wouldn't be very, it's not complete. We can see what's going on, see the suffering, especially the grosser ways that people are suffering in this world or being suffering in this world, and then respond effectively to it. Don't just become aware of it or use it, for self-purpose. Let's carry on into the last bits of acceptance here. Um, I don't think I'll do any of the questions that I think I had one or two questions. I'm going to skip this section because I think we all get it. I talked about it earlier, acceptance and goals. You can have goals still, and acceptance doesn't mean that you just accept where you're at and what's going on and don't do anything to improve your life. I think we all understand that well enough. Um, this is something maybe you can think about. I won't invite answers to this now because we have spent a little bit more time on this little byway into talking about karma and what have you, which I hope was productive. But is there, in your recollection, a time when you needed to accept what was going on in order to move forward, and that you can see that that was a big part of it? That once you were kind of blocked, and then once you were able to accept what was happening, again, doesn't mean condone, doesn't mean it's all perfectly fine, doesn't mean repress. It means that I'm just going to accept that this is what's going on so I can then move forward. I can actually do something. So you might think about that. And if you want to share it with um, others or what have you, I think it might be useful, but at least to do that investigation yourself. Some concluding thoughts from the Book of Joy on this subject. Life is constantly unpredictable, uncontrollable, and often quite challenging. Again, this wonderful Holocaust survivor, Edith Eva Eger, she's still alive and quite a spunky person from what I've seen in her talks and that. She explained that life in a concentration camp was an endless selection line where one never knew whether one would live or die. The guards would be putting people into different lines. So you go over there, you go over there, and you never know. Am I in the line going to the gas chambers? Am I in the line going out to do the work? Imagine that type of life, where every day was an endless selection line. The only thing that kept a person alive was the acceptance of the reality of one's existence and the attempt to respond as best one could. Curiosity about what would happen next, even when she was left for dead in a pile of bodies. This is in her biography. It's really quite moving, was often all she had to pull herself forward to the next breath. An acceptance and a curiosity, being able to have some curiosity about what comes next. This is a quote from her that I think is what Douglas Abrams was alluding to, a speech that she gave in 2015. What kept me going in the concentration camp was my curiosity. I always told myself, if I survive today, I will be free tomorrow. One strength I developed in the camp was to let go of things I have no control of. There is no crisis, just transitions. There are no problems, just challenges. So again, her whole thing of just being curious, just being open to what's going on, accepting that that is on her plate. That is her reality. I mean, again, same type of mindset I think that Viktor Frankl was using in Auschwitz. She had a similar experience. That if you're able to accept it, and also she mentions kind of this hope, right? If I survive today, I will be free tomorrow. Also a very important quality. It's not in the 8 that we're talking about here, these 8 pillars, but so when we accept what is happening now, we can be curious about what might happen next. Acceptance was the final pillar of the mind, and it led us to the first pillar of the heart, forgiveness. When we accept the present, we can forgive and release the desire for a different past. So forgiveness is the next subject, and it's really, sometimes I teach whole weekends on forgiveness. It's kind of interesting. One author, Ken MacLeod, he says that forgiveness isn't Buddhist. He has a very interesting approach to that. I'll get into forgiveness in a moment. Let me go ahead and share on screen the practices for acceptance that I'm going to encourage you to work with if you feel so inclined, if that's something you'd like to do. Reflect on either of those. I mentioned both Master Shantideva's verse and then also the Serenity Prayer, whichever one resonates best for you, or work with both of them if you wish. Recall a time in your life when you practiced acceptance and try to see the effect that it had in the moment. Then thinking of someone, or something you are having a hard time with, maybe it's someone you're having a hard time accepting, acknowledge that this is the nature of reality, that you cannot know all the factors involved, and that you can actually use it in a positive way. Because again, I think that's a part of it. When we say acceptance, we don't just mean, oh, I'm going to accept it and I'm just going to resign myself to that misery and whatever's going on. It means I'm going to accept it and I'm going to respond effectively, do something positive, see the positive side of it. Again, notice any change that happens internally when you do that. All right. Back to forgiveness. I might mention before we get started on forgiveness, I never really taught on forgiveness until I had the good fortune of doing an interfaith panel on forgiveness with this interesting character in Santa Fe. His name is Reverend Phil. He goes by Reverend Phil, and he has the Church of the One God, and he has on his business card all the different religious symbols. And his whole approach was that he's going to take a bit of what he sees of the good stuff in each tradition and practice that way. Perfectly fine path, right? You know, maybe doesn't get to the full results of any particular path, but nonetheless, you know, came to really admire him and working with him. He used to have a little cable TV show that was called Words of the Prophet, and he invited, sounds like a joke, I know, me, a Buddhist teacher, a Jewish rabbi, a retired Episcopalian minister, and a unity minister to a panel on forgiveness. You know, we don't all walk into a bar. That's not where it took place. But the idea is that I learned a lot by hearing other people talk about forgiveness, and I had to kind of articulate what the Buddhist view is on forgiveness. And as I said, I had never received many teachings on it, but you know, I read a little of what Jack Kornfield said, and I said, yeah, that sounds like it's pretty much in line. But I was surprised at what I was hearing in the way in which, of course, all these other traditions were theistic. When things get to be theistic, then you have another dimension of forgiveness, which is because God is your creator, there's an element of needing God's forgiveness. In Buddhism, I don't need to worry about that. They actually all chuckled when I mentioned that, you know, we don't believe in a creator God, so this isn't a problem for us. But you can actually still find this on YouTube if you're interested. Words of the Prophet, I don't know which episode it was, but just put in forgiveness, and I'm betting it'll come up for you if you want, if you're curious. But it was an interesting panel. And for me to teach on forgiveness there, again, that was quite enlightening to hear other perspectives and to recognize that Buddhism's approach to it is slightly different. Anyway, just a little prelude to what we're going to talk about. I couldn't really find a real cartoon comic, you know, for forgiveness. Maybe it's too serious of a subject, but I did find this sort of editorial cartoon with Nelson Mandela and a quote from him. He says, "Forgiveness liberates the soul. That is why it is such a powerful weapon." So we all know of, and this was actually when he passed away. They had that as one of the editorial cartoons, and I don't know which newspaper, but the discussion on forgiveness actually begins with the Archbishop talking about his experiences during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Again, this was after, apartheid. Again, we talk about slavery still having its ramifications in this country. Apartheid still has its ramifications in South Africa. It's not like these things completely go away or that the effects of them don't linger. They are absolutely there. But he talks about it, and I'm not going to share the whole story. Many of you have read the book, but there's one woman who shows up at these reconciliation commissions, and she talks about her experience of seeing her son on television. They have someone there, a reporter who was documenting it, his dead body being dragged through the streets by the government officials in that were the military that were there. And she gets so upset at one of the guys from that side who's there that she actually gets her shoe and throws it at him. And after things calm down, they have a little break and they kind of bring them all back together. She gets to a point where she has this soft spot, this tenderness that she expresses, where she ends up calling this man who was part of the group of people who dragged her son through the streets. She says, "My son." She actually refers to him as her son in a very endearing way, like she begins to see a chance of forgiveness, a way to be able to open to that possibility. Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I don't know everything about it, but it was a way to provide more community-wide healing as opposed to our traditional judicial systems that can be very severe in terms of punishments and ramifications. But when you have a joint process where those who are offended and the victim side, as we label it, and those who are the perpetrators can sit down with each other and really express what this has meant to them and what has happened to them and how this has affected them and the pain that they've had from it. And also on the other side, explaining, why they did what they did and what have you. It's truth and reconciliation. It's an opportunity for people to come together in ways that will be much more healing in the long term than locking people up and doing all sorts of things that are not productive. So you can read those, pages 229 to 231 in the book. Forgiveness, the Archbishop added, is the only way to heal ourselves and to be free from the past. He has a daughter named Mpo, and he wrote a book called The Book of Forgiving. Without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who harmed us. We are bound to the chains of bitterness, tied together, trapped. This is this phrase that's sometimes used about like, is that person, are you still, are they still your captor? Well, if you're carrying them with you, then they are. Whether you're still trapped by them in terms of what they did, well, then you are still going to be under their control. If we're able to forgive and sort of free all of that, then we're no longer bound to those chains of bitterness, resentment, and so on. There's another Buddhist phrase that's used frequently around what not forgiving is like, or holding on to a grudge, resentment towards somebody. They say it's like holding a hot coal and waiting to throw it at somebody. Well, the person who offended you, you're waiting for them to come back into your life that you can throw that hot coal at them. Well, who's getting burned holding the hot coal, folks? The only way that we can actually be free of any of the pain, any of the difficulty, any of what we are exacerbating in ourselves is through forgiveness, through a process of getting to a place where we actually can forgive. Talk about fake it till you make it. This is also something we might have to do, because forgiveness, we're not really taught so well how to forgive, or certainly even how to apologize in our culture. And we tend to think that it's just a rote little "I'm sorry." If we get the other person to say "I'm sorry," then we can absolve them. It's sometimes a lot deeper than that. We're going to have some stories in this. We already had some wonderful stories. Thank you for sharing your story, Carol. I mean, of these are the sorts of things that we're moving into with these four of the heart, where we're really going to be looking at qualities that help us to find a joy that is about releasing so much of the stuff that traps our hearts. Until we can forgive the person who harmed us, that person will hold the keys to our happiness. That person will be our jailer. When we forgive, we take back control of our own fate and our feelings. We become our own liberator. So who imprisons you? Yourself. Who who lets yourself free? Well then yourself. But it says here the person will be our jailer, but that's because we've made them our jailer. We have put them in that position. Yes, they harmed you. I'm not denying that. There is an act of harm that has happened that we have been on the receiving end of, and we are, looking at that person through a different lens now. Instead of thinking vindictively with resentment and spite, we are instead going to say, how do I release myself from that? It's in our hands. We make them our jailer, in a sense, and we become our own liberator. Here's another quote from Edith Eva Eger from her book. I mentioned this last night, The Choice. I really, for me, I mentioned this already, but I can't emphasize it enough. That one of the gifts of reading the Book of Joy was all these peripheral books that I read. When I read The Choice, I was really moved by her whole story. There's another book by Anthony Hinton called The Sun Does Rise, I think is the name of it. There's going to be some quotes from that. And that's a really, really powerful book to read as well. I think Edith Eva Eger's book is better in some ways, but that was just my own personal preference. But they're both well worth reading. Some life stories that are just inspiring. She says, forgiveness isn't easy. It is easier to hold grudges, to seek revenge. I tell of my fellow Holocaust survivors, the courageous men and women I met in Israel, who looked pained when I mentioned forgiveness, who insisted that to forgive is to condone or to forget. Why forgive? Doesn't that let Hitler off the hook for what he did? And not just Hitler, but so many other people who were complicit in what happened in Nazi Germany. My dear friend Larry Gladstone called to say that he knew of a lawyer representing Holocaust survivors in reparations cases. He encouraged me to step forward as a survivor to claim my due. That was a right choice for many, but not for me. It felt like blood money, as if one could put a price on my parents' heads. She lost her parents in the concentration camp. A way to stay chained to those who had tried to destroy us. It's kind of interesting. She had this perspective that she'd gotten to a place of such forgiveness that it felt like to go into a place of even receiving some kind of reparations due to that having happened, to be in that position, kept her bound, kept her tied back up with it. She needed that freedom that forgiveness gave. She didn't need to be chained again. She says it's too easy to make a prison out of our pain, out of the past. At best, revenge is useless. It can't alter what was done to us. It can't erase the wrongs we've suffered. It can't bring back the dead. At worst, revenge perpetuates the cycle of hate. And I can't help but think of what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And this is the huge error that humanity keeps making again and again and again, right? That we think that taking revenge is somehow the way to rectify a wrong. When we've been wronged on one side, beings doing, again, horrific acts. I'm not denying that. October 7th was horrible, what was done to the people in Israel. And what has been done to the people in Gaza since then is horrible equally, right? It's all part of the same horrible mess, the same horrible situation. At worst, it keeps the cycle of hate going. There's not going to be any resolution to the problem that's peaceful if this is the mentality that people keep using. I love this wonderful phrase. I'll take it off screen for a moment for just breaking that up a bit. Wonderful phrase from the Dhammapada that I've had a few quotes from. Again, this wonderful collection of sayings of the Buddha. And I'm going to use Jack Kornfield's translation of this. He says, hatred is never overcome by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal truth. I like that last part, ancient and eternal truth. It's the eternal truth. It's not something that the Buddha came up with. It's not something that we have to get to some great philosopher on a mountain to hear from. This is the eternal truth, that you're never going to conquer hatred through hatred. You're only going to conquer it through love. Goes back to your question earlier, Mary, about you don't repress, you replace the hatred, the animosity, whatever, with loving kindness, compassion. That's the only way you're going to heal hatred and get rid of hatred. And forgiveness is rooted in all of that. Forgiveness is understanding the situation from a larger vantage point, perspective, changing our perspective, and seeing that our response should be one that is opposing hatred, not one that creates more hatred in the world. We have plenty of hatred, folks. Do we need more hatred? Do we need to be creating that in our hearts and being a manifestation of that in our world? Okay. So let's go to the rest of this little quote from the delightful Edith Eva Eger. She says, "It keeps the hate circling on and on. When we seek revenge, even nonviolent revenge, we are revolving, not evolving." Um, I think some of what we have in our culture might be considered nonviolent revenge in terms of imprisoning people. I've actually done some work in prison with people who've been interested in Buddhist teachings and try to give them teachings, especially to work with their minds in such a difficult situation of being in prison. And there's a value in some ways. It's for separating people from society when they have done wrongs to where they are a danger to others and to themselves. But our problem, of course, with our prison system is that it doesn't do anything to correct the minds of these people or men and women who end up in prison and who have to just try to make it by as best as they can while they're there. And if they do get released, try to deal with a world that they haven't really developed the skills and the understanding to be able to work with it. But, we have to find a way to get out of this cycle of things being punishment. I remember when I went through one of my volunteer trainings in the prison, the assistant warden said, "The men aren't here to be punished. Being here is their punishment." And I kept scratching my head like, well, what's the difference between Not sure I'm getting the point. Ideally, anything, I'm sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox about prisons, but ideally they should be, we call them correctional facilities, but that's the idea they have is maybe that they're being corrected there in some way, correcting their path, but they don't do enough to correct people. They don't do enough to support people because they don't have this, again, is the underlying concept that we need to instill in people these more positive qualities and values so that they can be back in the world and live from that place rather than a place of revenge, hatred, what have you. And of course, there's a lot of other, I'm not going to get into all the other social injustice issues that have allowed for so many people, especially people of color, to end up in prison. Those are another thing that, of course, needs to be rectified in our world. The list keeps getting longer and longer whenever we look at all these sorts of things. But hatred and things that are based on a society and a mechanism of hatred is never going to be productive. We're never going to have anything good come out of that. Two little kind of cute, interesting ways of looking at forgiveness. I like Jack Kornfield's. It kind of gives me a chuckle sometimes. Forgiveness means giving up all hope of a better past. You can't do much about your past. Your past is what your past was. These things happen. They just, we're products of whatever. If we want to call them karma, if we want to call it whatever, these things we had to experience. They did happen. Can't deny that they happen. So we accept them, and then we give up all hope of that being somehow becoming better. Forgiveness also does not change the past, but enlarges the future. I like this quote from Paul Bose. I think he's from the guy that's from Kansas or something. When I looked him up, he's not really known for much other than this quote. I'm not sure what his whole claim to fame was, but I'm going to keep his memory alive by using this quote. But I like the future aspect of this. It doesn't change the past, but it does enlarge the potential for the future. And again, there's many of these stories of forgiveness we'll get into as we go through this. Aspects of forgiveness that we are going to look at. The Buddhist perspective for forgiveness. Again, and because I felt comfortable sharing it in that little panel of spiritual leaders or whatever, I'm happy to share it with you. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. It does not mean allowing wrongdoing. It doesn't mean a weakness. These are 3 points that I think are well worth reiterating because we have a tendency to view forgiving through those lens of being those things. And then how to forgive. Spend a little time on this. Again, I won't go into the full depth that I do, obviously, when I do a whole weekend on forgiveness, but at least give you some context for how to work with it. We're getting close to our 5:30 break, and I want to make sure I honor that, but let me do just a little bit on the Buddhist perspective. This is, again, I believe, from Douglas Abrams saying, "Your Holiness," this brings us to a question from a boy named Jack who writes, "Your Holiness, I have the utmost respect for you and your people and for your undying message of kindness and forgiveness. Yet I wonder, can you forgive China for all of the harm and pain they have caused you and your people? Do they deserve it?" And I'm sure His Holiness feels the pain, as I mentioned earlier, of the Tibetan people and what they've had to endure. Some of the stories that he's heard as people have come to him in Dharamsala are just outrageous. What people have had to endure, especially monks and nuns, who, for example, have been forced to copulate in prison, have been forced to do all sorts of things, really horrific stuff. In our struggle, we deliberately try to stop ourselves from developing anger or hatred. Of course, the Chinese are wonderful people. This is His Holiness's response. I should have prefaced it with that. But even for the hardliners, the officials, we deliberately tried to keep a sense of compassion, a sense of concern for their well-being. So he's starting off by saying, yeah, I can have a general compassion for the Chinese people at large because they're not the ones necessarily doing these things. But even the officials and the people who are causing this kind of pain and suffering for Tibetan people, he wants to have a sense of compassion, a sense of concern for their well-being. The Dalai Lama then spoke in Tibetan and Thupten Jinpa translated. Generally, when we speak of cultivating compassion for someone, we are cultivating compassion for someone who is actually undergoing acute suffering and pain. So I was mentioning earlier, that's a really visceral way for us to get in touch with the suffering of others is when we see it in front of us and we see that someone's in mental or physical pain, anguish, and we respond to it with an opening of our heart. But you can also develop compassion for someone who may not be experiencing acute pain or suffering right now, but who is creating the conditions for their own future suffering. And again, we end up back at karma, and this is the Buddhist view of how to work with forgiveness, is we understand that wrongdoers, people who are wronging us or wronging others, are going to experience the suffering of those actions. No. Maybe whether they're caught or not, we have a mentality in the US of like you can do whatever you want. If you get caught, then it's a problem. If you don't, then you can just keep living with the consequences that you got away with it. Well, this isn't how karma works. Karma, again, it's got your address. It knows what's going on. There is a force that is with you that will ripen into a future experience of suffering based on the things that you've done that were blinded by ignorance and done under the control of these crazy states of mind. And how sad that that's the case again. So there's a compassion for the wrongdoer. I'm going to do a little paraphrase of a wonderful verse from Master Shantideva from his very first chapter of his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He says, sentient beings long for happiness, and yet they run away from its causes. They also desire to not suffer, but they run towards its causes. And this is what breaks the Bodhisattva's heart, is that we look at sentient beings and we see that they're doing the exact opposite of what will actually bring them happiness and free them from suffering. As I said, the understanding of karma enriches our compassion because it's just sad. It's just sad. If they had that knowledge and lived with that knowledge and worked from that knowledge, they wouldn't suffer. Our suffering, our happiness is in our own hands. Again, it's the karmic view. Though I'm throwing it out there again, but it really is the underpinning. And this is what I explained when I did that little panel, is that it's all based on the principle of karma, that we feel that we need to forgive others who have harmed us because we understand that they are doing these actions under the control of their crazy minds. They wouldn't be doing it if they had control and they were able to actually be in a more positive state of mind. They knew the causes of happiness and the causes of suffering. But because sentient beings lack that, because they are ignorant, they create their own suffering. They avoid their own happiness. That's just the nature of the way things are. And it can be different. So that's the whole point. We forgive others because we have that understanding. Let me stop there, I think, because it is time, 5:30, and just want to see if there's a question or two, perhaps, or a comment. Again, they don't have to be questions. Can be something you feel you need to say, and everything has been wonderful this whole retreat. I'm really like, you guys are doing a great job, by the way, because you're really giving me stuff that is getting us into the material, getting us into talking about this stuff, and that's the important thing. Yes, Chris.
One thing that really bothers me lately is
Uh-huh.
the media, the movies and television in the United States right now,
Mm-hmm.
because the flip side of our belief that innocents who are hurt
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be blamed
Right.
seems to be that if you can prove that somebody's guilty, then you can do, is it Schadenfreude?
Schadenfreude.
Sure, yeah, you can really enjoy visually them getting melted and burned and get killed, and all the things that happen in
Right.
films. And
Right.
now, because you proved that this guy was evil,
Mhm,
so that we
mhm.
can watch and get all of this suffering and stuff. And
Hmm.
and it's really against my vows, but still
Yeah.
it bothers me that we're bombarded with this all the time, that we're enjoying this ugly kind of joy
Yes.
is we're being served up
Think-
so often. And I protest.
Me too. Join. I'm glad you brought that up, Chris. I've actually been pretty dismayed. I don't really watch a lot of movies. I don't know. Because I've been just we get inundated with revenge movies. Everything becomes about, okay, this person's been wronged, and then the whole rest of the movie is about them trying to get revenge on the people who've wronged them. And everyone feeling clapping and being joyful at the end because those bad guys have gotten their comeuppance, you know. I'm just like, that's not the right mentality for people to have. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Patrick.
That brings up the question is why is Chris's karma showing her these things, and why was your karma all that Netflix wants to show you is revenge movies? How to fix that?
So why are those things that I'm seeing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Or
like,
those are
okay,
things.
so your karma is arising is that when you turn on the movies, they all suck because they're revenge movies.
Yeah.
How do you fix that?
I think again we can say that there's a certain amount of conditioning that has gone on in our world and perhaps in our own past actions that has ripened into this being what is seen as entertainment, what is out there in terms of what the media does. And we can say there's a karma that's happening at a different level, that we often call this like forms of collective karma, where we create cultures and ways of being in the world that are a product of many individuals buying into a particular way of looking at things. Now, because I choose and Chris chooses and whoever else wants to get on our bandwagon and chooses that we're going to look at these things through a negative lens and say, this is not what we're going to watch and what we're going to subscribe to and what we're going to take part in and rejoice in and have that Schadenfreude. That's a way of changing our own individual karma, but it may not change the world around us that quickly, right? These films are still going to keep being made. And as long as Hollywood is making money off of revenge films and the media keeps getting all the commercial money they need to air all the stuff that they are, it's not going to change in that outer thing. But I can change my own inner response or way of working with those things or not having anything to do with those things. Does that make sense? Is that answering your question? Or maybe I didn't
Does
get.
make sense. And I was kind of thinking on a personal level, I was kind of
Yeah.
playing devil's advocate. I mean, like, did you do a lot of revenge action in past lives? And is that, I mean,
that I'm
otherwise it would, you just
if,
beautiful movies would be the only thing arising. Is that a correct karmic explanation?
yeah, I was a movie star in my prior life and I made a lot of revenge films. No. I mean, these things again are when we talk about things that are like the media or the films, obviously, and you're kind of poking fun at that's a different level of experience than if someone's actually taking revenge on me, where I can say the karma I would have created to have people who are very vengeful and trying to get at me, even though it seems like I didn't do anything or whatever, that would be a karma that would be a product of my own past actions of being vengeful towards other people. But to have these things in our world, again, we can see that they're a product of many different causes and conditions. Yeah, there's a karma involved, but the karma becomes much slighter in terms of the individual and much more of a collective way that this is the world that we've created, where we have these sorts of ways of seeking entertainment and what have you. So I don't know. Anyway, not sure I can completely answer the question because we do tend to say that everything is a product of karma, but the degree to which it's a product of our own individual situation gets to be very specific in terms of I can make a choice. I can choose not to watch those sorts of films. I can choose not to engage in that part of society. And that doesn't necessarily remove them from society, but it removes them from my experience. And I might emphasize that while we're on the subject of that sort of thing, Buddhism said there's nothing wrong with initially going to change the external situation that might be causing you suffering or difficulty. That's part of that verse from Master Shantideva, right? If there's something you can do about it, do it. Don't get all bent out of shape and whatever. Turn the TV off, go to another channel, watch your, Downton Abbey or whatever, something that's going to be much calmer and a little less crazy. Whatever it is that you feel you need to do to change the external situation, just recognize that changing the external isn't changing the internal. We do have to do the internal work as well. So take what steps we can to change how we are in the world and the things that we are inviting into our lives and into our mind streams and what have you. But recognize that we have to do deeper work as well. Nothing wrong with making changes like that, but just don't think those are the final result, or, the final way of getting to a peaceful place. Let's go ahead and break. We're already at 5:36. 5:36, okay. Just do a few mini thoughts about dedicating. If you do have some additional questions, please hold on to them. Maybe write them down, and when we resume at 7 o'clock, you can bring them up. But just take a moment to think about once more, even this past hour and a half, the time that we've spent looking at acceptance, beginning to look at forgiveness, the seeds that we planted. Everything is about planting seeds. We plant these seeds in our mind stream so that they will ripen into beautiful flowers, in a sense, become amazing qualities for us in the future through our tending and nurturing them. We have to make that thought, dedicating that they will continue to do that they will bring forth the result that we aspire for. So go ahead and have those thoughts. May whatever I have done here in this last hour and a half become the cause for me to have greater joy in my life through learning to accept my reality, especially my suffering, and to also learn to forgive when we see others who are wronging us, as well as to forgive ourselves. And we'll continue this investigation of forgiveness when we resume. Okay. All right. Let's take our little break. Again, you've got a little time before dinner. Dinner will be on at 6 o'clock. And then, as I said, if we can be back here at 7, and we'll just continue on, carry on. Sometimes I find when I do retreats that the evening is like the worst. Afternoons are bad in their own way because, everybody's had lunch and they're just kind of getting into that distracted mode. And then evenings are almost impossible. So I usually do something else in the evenings rather than teach. But I think you're stuck with me teaching tonight. So sorry. Really? Just no snoring, okay?